Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Foreign Policy Analysis 412. I look forward to continuing this online with you guys. Today, we're going to continue talking about liberalism, and in particular, the democratic peace theory, which is, we can say, a state level theory that derives from liberalism. As we talked about, liberalism operates both at the systemic level and at the state level. And so we're going to talk about the democratic peace theory. The democratic peace theory does not argue that democracies are more peaceful in general. Rather, it argues that democracies do not fight wars with other democracies. It doesn't necessarily say that they are more peaceful when interacting with non-democracies. Now, there's quite a bit of statistical evidence for this, although scholars are constantly debating with each other about this, but there seems to be something to this. But there is no clear consensus about why this is the case. How does this come about? Now, there have been two main explanations for the democratic peace theory. The first one is the structural explanation. According to the structural argument, democracies don't engage in wars with other democracies because of the unique institutional setup that democracy has. So number one, democracy has elections, democratic elections. Leaders want to win elections, and they are fearful that if they start a war, engage in military adventures outside of their own boundaries, they will not get re-elected. So that's the democratic accountability argument. Secondly, in democracies, you have civil liberties. You have freedom of expression, freedom of association, you have a free press. And because of that, the media, but also grassroots organizations, the common citizens, can put pressure on the government between elections, not just during elections, but between elections, to follow certain particular policies. So because of that, democracies are less likely to go to war. And thirdly, democracies contain democratic procedures within their operating framework that make them less likely to go to war. And one key word here is veto player. Democracies have lots of veto players. A veto player is an actor that can say no. So, most sort of obviously, in democracies, you have parliament, you have the legislative branch. And if the executive branch wants to do something, the legislative branch has a say in that. Within the legislative branch, you also have different checks and balances. So if you have a bicameral system, like in the US or in Pakistan, the National Assembly will pass a bill and the Senate will say no. So there's multiple levels of veto players in democracies, which make decision making a bit slower and make it less likely for a leader of a country to engage in a rash military action. Now, that's a pretty convincing argument, but the structural argument doesn't really explain why two democracies don't fight each other. It might explain why one democracy is more peaceful, but not why do these two democracies interact in a peaceful manner with each other when that doesn't happen when a non-democracy and a democracy interact with one another. So there's something missing. The second argument is the normative argument. According to the normative argument, it is peaceful norm of conflict resolution that democracies have developed over time that shapes how they act in the international arena. So, in democracies, like in any other societies, there are big points of conflict, different opinions, groups, and individuals who have very different interests, sometimes very intensely different interests. But in democracies, they have developed a mode of finding solutions or compromises to these conflicts without coming to blows with one another. So, in parliamentary politics, for instance, you've got 2, 3, 4, 5 political parties that all have very different opinions about a particular political issue, um, but they all agree on the procedures that are inherent in the democracy, and so even if they violently disagree with one another, they will still accept the final result. And oftentimes, to get a final result, you have to compromise with the other side. And so the argument goes that when two democracies are facing each other, they will externalize this domestic peaceful norm of conflict resolution to their foreign policy behavior. Now, if they do not interact with a democracy but with a non-democracy, they will not externalize this behavior because they know the other democracy doesn't have these peaceful norms of conflict resolution. So here they will act in such a way to ensure their survival in a way that conforms to realist principles. But when two democracies interact with one another, they will activate their peaceful norms of conflict resolution. Now, both of these theories have been criticized for not, first of all, explaining the entirety of the process of how democracies don't go to war with one another. And furthermore, they've maybe, the criticism has been that they are artificially separated from one another when in fact they work in tandem with one another. And so John Owen, in his article, argues that in fact one has to combine these two arguments and one has to add the element of perceptions. Because it's not just about objectively, is this a democracy or not, but it's about, does the population, do the leaders of one country actually recognize the other country as democratic, as liberal or not? So John Owen has a third argument, which we're going to call the liberal perceptions argument. According to this argument, there's two main players in a society. There's the population, the society, and there's the leaders. Now, if you have a liberal population, a liberal society, they will want to have good relations and cooperate with other liberal states, but they will, and John Owen argues, they will act in a more hostile, aggressive manner towards non-democracies. Now, if a population does not recognize another country as a liberal society or a liberal state, then they may advocate for war, conflict, if there are already tensions between those two countries. But if they recognize the other country as a democracy or as a liberal state, in the 19th century really there weren't any democracies, so John Owen expands the argument to liberal states that had certain rights and protections and certain democratic institutions. If they recognize the other state as a liberal state, then they will advocate, the population will put pressure on the government to have a peaceful conflict resolution with that other state. Now, what happens when a liberal society elects illiberal leaders, which of course we have lots of examples nowadays of, with this wave of populists being elected into various governments. John Owen says, even if you have illiberal leaders who want to engage in violent conflict with other liberal states, the population will not let them. They will put pressure on them. The media, grassroots organizations, opposition political parties will put pressure on the executive that will not allow an illiberal leader in a liberal society to engage in conflict with another liberal state that they perceive as liberal. And conversely, if the illiberal leader does not want to get into a violent conflict with an illiberal state, the population will still put pressure on them to nevertheless engage in violent military conflict with that other state. And so John Owen argues it's all about the perceptions. If two states recognize each other as liberal, they will not go to war with each other. But if they don't recognize each other as liberal, irrespective of the fact of are they actually liberal or democratic or not, they will not go to war. They will go to war with each other. Now, John Owen lists 4 case studies. So your job now, for your assignment, is to outline in detail how John Owen's argument about the liberal perceptions plays out in detail in at least 2 of those case studies. And I have written the dates in the PowerPoint presentation. So I look forward to seeing your response.